New Japan Pro Wrestling is never going to be a big thing in the United States, and it's never really going to be the number one wrestling promotion in the world. And that's just the way it is. Sup, y'all? Welcome back to the review space. I want to talk about Njpw, New Japan Pro Wrestling. And, you know, every now and then I'll hear some people, hey, I don't watch WWE anymore. I don't watch WWE anymore. I'd rather watch New Japan Pro Wrestling. You know, it's all about New Japan Pro Wrestling. I love New Japan. WWE is not good. You know, if you want good in-ring competition, if you want the best in-ring wrestlers and the best in-ring performers, go watch New Japan instead. You know, go watch New Japan instead of WWE. And I hear that every now and then, and I think some people tend to overhype New Japan and put New Japan on a pedestal because, number one, they want an alternative from the typical, you know, generic WWE product, and number two, it's a little bit different from your usual mainstream, you know, product. And also, too, I think a lot of it has to do with the internet wrestling fan base. People like a Dave Meltzer and you know, even somebody like an Alvarez, and these guys that's kind of like smart marky, you know, all about the in-ring work rate, you know, especially guys like Dave Meltzer, these Wrestling Observer followers, people that follow the in-ring work rate, and it has to be, you know, everything has to be like a 5-star, 6-star, 7-star, 9-star matches, where it's all about long matches of attrition, you know what I'm saying, a lot of strong style, and that Japanese strong style, that high-flying hybrid mixed with, you know, very strong submissions mixed with crazy bumps and dives and a lot of stiff kicks and stiff punches and hits. And, you know, some people mark out to that. Some people buy into the hype, especially with people like Dave Meltzer giving it so much praise. You know what I'm saying? Like, the only couple of matches that got over 5 stars in his rating would be the Okada-Omega matches. You know, Kenny Omega against Kazuchika Okada, and their long matches of attrition. You know, they're huge, hyped up matches that get so much online praise and a lot of you know, smart mark Wrestling Observer praise. You know, some people tend to gravitate around that kind of stuff, and for me, it's not really my thing. You know, I'm more of I like more mainstream style wrestling, something that's more reminiscent of the Attitude Era, late 90s, you know, a lot of entertaining characters, for example, or a lot of fascinating storytelling, and a lot of invested interest in the characters and the storylines. You know, it makes it feel important. It's not just a bunch of long matches and almost like the sports-like feel to it, but rather I prefer that late 90s Monday Night Wars era of wrestling. You're talking about WWF back in the day against WCW. And each one had their own positives and negatives. You know, and I'm not saying I'm against great in-ring performances. Of course, there's a lot of great matches out there that I like. One of my personal favorites, especially when I was younger, was Low Key against AJ Styles. I think the promotion might have been like 0-1 or something like that. One of those like smaller Japanese promotions, and they had a really incredible, you know, high spot match. You know what I'm saying? Kind of like many years later, it kind of had the same impression with Will Ospreay against Ricochet in, I think it was New Japan as well. They had that New Japan Classic back in, I want to say that was 2016, where they were flipping and diving like crazy. And it was this incredibly athletic, highly action-packed, but very dynamic in-ring moves. And it was so incredible, and it was so completely different from, you know, what we usually see on a regular basis. You know, the more slow-down, slow-paced matches of WWE, or the more toned-down, you know, matches. But the thing is, you know, you also gotta have a lot of interesting characters and unique personalities. And I don't think New Japan has that. You know, New Japan is missing a lot of stuff that really doesn't appeal to a more Western or even a more mainstream market outside of the New Japan bubble, outside of the you know, the Japanese market or the Japanese strong style bubble. Like, that works for them. The sports-like atmosphere, that works for them, and because that's what they're used to. That's what they've always had, that tradition of that Antonio Inoki favored, legitimate in-ring, very stiff, very MMA-oriented type of presentation. They've always been more about that, like having actual MMA competitors in there. Somebody like a Bob Sapp, or somebody like a Kurt Angle. That if I'm not mistaken, Kurt ended up winning the IWGP, one of the belts that was held, taken by Brock Lesnar. After he I think he left New Japan or something. He just stopped competing there after a while. But anyway, yeah, guys like Brock Lesnar. There's another one, a guy that has that legitimate background. So New Japan has always had that strong style, that kind of stiff in-ring, very MMA influenced kind of style. But the thing is, WWE doesn't do it that way. And, it's not so much entertainment oriented. It's not so much about funny segments or having charismatic characters or incredible promos. That's what I miss the most about WWE. And even WCW. Back when they had guys like Scott Steiner and Ric Flair and even Hollywood Hogan and the NWO, and when they were cutting promos. Even somebody like Raven. I remember Raven, who was basically just a mid-carder in WCW, but he had the Ravens flock and all that, and he was cutting promos. Even Chris Jericho, guys like him, that was given some shine on the mic and some promo time. These guys were entertaining characters. They were allowed to be themselves. They were allowed to have a character that was developed and fleshed out. They might not have made it into the the main event scene. They might not have been WCW World Champions back when they were there in the late 90s, but they got some time to shine, and they got some time to kind of have their own character. You had to have incredible talent. You had to have charismatic personality. You had to have that presence on the microphone and be able to cut a glib, a very clever promo that was like attention-getting and very interesting. And it was very defined for your character to have. You know what I'm saying? Somebody that sounded like, okay, without even looking at the character, without even like looking at the TV screen, I can already tell that's Macho Man Randy Savage, or that's Hollywood Hogan, or that's Raven, or that's DDP, or that's Goldberg. Just hearing their voice and having that personality shine through in the audio. And when you listen to guys in New Japan, they don't really focus much on promos or characters. Not really. I mean, they'll have a tagline. They'll have, the Switchblade, Jay White. You'll have, somebody like Okada, the Rainmaker Okada. You know what I'm saying? So they'll have like a tagline in their name, but aside from having a certain look and maybe wearing a cute little jacket or having a cool little, quirky little entrance like Shinsuke Nakamura, nobody really stands out as far as having a definitive, interesting character that you can kind of identify with, especially on the microphone. And that's another big part of the problem with New Japan Pro Wrestling, is that there's a huge language barrier. And I think I mentioned this several years ago. I made a video a long time ago here on YouTube, probably back in 2014, called Why Japanese Wrestlers Never Make It in America. And I gave reasons. One of the main reasons was a lot of the Japanese wrestlers, they can't speak English and they can't cut a promo in the same language that a Western country like America or even a Canada would have. So already they have that disconnect with the audience. You can't fully understand what they're saying, even if they have an accent, and it's usually a really thick accent. They can barely string a couple of words together in English. Even somebody like Shinsuke, who is already hard to understand to begin with that mouth guard, and then he's trying to speak in a very thick Japanese accent, and it's so hard to understand him. He's not fluent in English. None of these wrestlers, people like Asuka, can't speak English fluently. So much less people like an Okada and Tanahashi and these guys that, Naito, guys that might have some in-ring ability and they have a certain look. And of course that in-ring 5-star, ability to have those great matches, they still don't have that charismatic, larger-than-life personality that the English-speaking crowd can get behind. And speaking of Asuka, that's another huge part of the problem, is that, in my opinion, New Japan should have some women in their roster, an actual female division, but they don't. You know what I'm saying? They don't really have women on the roster. They might have a valet or something like that, or a couple of chicks that, I think that, the guy in Bullet Club, Yujiro, whatever, the pimp, and he'd bring in a couple of women, you know what I'm saying, but they're clearly just like a bunch of HOs and just a couple of chicks that's like, more for eye candy than anything else, but we don't really have in-ring performers. Like, when I think of people like Asuka, like, you think women, Japanese women like Asuka, Kairi Sane, Io Shirai, and all these different women that we see recently in the past couple of years signed by WWE, you'd think that they would have been in New Japan to begin with. If New Japan is really the second biggest wrestling promotion in the world, or at least the biggest promotion in Japan, you would think that they would have a female division, but they don't. It's all like split there. Japan is a different culture where it's like males and females are separate. The males have their own promotion, they got their own thing. The women have their own promotions, the smaller, like Joshi, female Japanese promotions and all that. So they, Stardom or whatever the heck it is, they have their own little thing going. And it doesn't have the budget or the backing or the exposure that New Japan gets, which I think is a shame. Like, they don't have a female division, or their version of a Divas division. They don't have that. So already, that's a huge negative against them, a huge strike against them compared to WWE, compared to Impact, TNA Impact, or even Ring of Honor with their Women of Honor division and all that. So I think it's a huge problem. It's a big issue that I don't know if that's ever going to happen, that New Japan ends up getting their own female division, because it's just separate. For some reason, it's separate. I never really delved too much into why it's like that in Japan. Maybe it's just a gender thing where the males got to have their own thing and the women got to be separated, because you can't have them, going, having any kind of interaction almost. Like, that might open up potential of having male versus female matches and those kind of things, which they have. I've seen, I think I've seen Asuka have matches against the male wrestlers. That other guy, I always forget his name, the older dude that has he's kind of got like a vicious pancrase background. I always forgot him. He's from the 90s. I always forget his name. That pancrase guy. He's a veteran. He's been around since like the 90s. Yeah. So it's not like Japanese women don't have matches with Japanese male wrestlers. They do every now and then, but it's like it's not in New Japan, and that's a huge thing missing from that company, is that they don't have that. And even just for like the beauty appeal, the triple X appeal, that kind of titillation with, you have sexy, beautiful women, the sex appeal and all that. Even just for that, like, we don't even get that. You know what I'm saying? So it's very, very limited, very just male performers oriented in New Japan. So they're lacking the sexiness, or the good looking chicks, or having that demographic. And also, I mean, you can go into other things like lack of video games. I can't really think of a single like New Japan video game, I guess, aside from the Fire Pro Wrestling thing. I guess Fire Pro Wrestling World, or one of the Fire Pro type games, maybe they have some ties to New Japan. Maybe they're sponsored by them. I don't know. I have no idea. But from what I heard, they're kind of tied with them. There is a bit of a inter-promotional thing going on with Fire Pro and New Japan, but I'm not so sure. They probably should, because Fire Pro is the only relevant Japanese wrestling video game, really, that kind of became like super popular in North America. I mean, aside from the Aki stuff like WCW, that was WCW Revenge and all that, and No Mercies, that was essentially it came from the Yukis. It's like Yuke's Aki kind of developer, publisher type of background. The WWE games, WWE wrestling games, and the SmackDown vs. Raw games, and even the 2K games, they can ultimately trace their lineage all the way to the Aki games of the Japanese video games. at least as far as the grappling system and all that. But the 90s is over, so we don't really have that Japanese presence in wrestling video games anymore. Again, aside from the Fire Pro Wrestling, but that's even Fire Pro is just a much smaller market. Not a lot of people really get into Fire Pro, and they really shouldn't. I don't think it's a fun game necessarily. It's just kind of a neat little simulator type of video game, but it's not really fun to play. It's more of a simulator. You kind of sit there, you arrange the little matches, have kind of arrange the different cards, have your own little pay-per-views, but you just kind of sit there and watch the AI, have matches. It's not really fun to play specifically because the grappling system is all messed up. It's not exactly fun. It's more tedious than anything else, and it's very timing based, and it's just not as fun or interesting as the WWE games. And so the WWE 2K series, I would say, is much better than any of the Japanese style games. And again, I can't think of a single New Japan game that was anything that's relevant that came out that we know about here in the Western countries. So in America, we don't know nothing about New Japan games. Canada, we know nothing about New Japan games, so it's we don't even know anything about the video games over. Even if they do, I would assume that they, it is a Japanese company. You would think that there's a Japanese game developer that is, making some New Japan NJPW type of video games, but I never really hear about them. I'm saying they're just kind of yeah, whatever. Maybe they did it on the PS2 days. I'm not sure, but I haven't really heard of any that's relevant that made it in the Western world. And maybe again, it's because New Japan really was never that big here in the Western market. And even now, again, a lot of people say that New Japan is the second biggest promotion in the world. It's the second biggest company, but it's they're really not that relevant. They're not, they're kind of like an underground, very smart mark, small time promotion, at least in terms of people knowing about it. They're not mainstream, they're not in the mainstream news or anything like that. But this whole thing with the MSG, for example, the MSG New Japan ROH joint show that's coming up. Okay, it's got some attention from some super wrestling smart mark fans, and I'm sure they're going to be enjoying it. But it's aside from the small group of really nerdy, super into the strong style, super underground fan base that loves ROH, that loves New Japan, that loves PWG or something like that. Aside from that, the mainstream fan base might not be up on that stuff. They might not be super interested in NJPW or anything like that because they're more about mainstream, major network type of wrestling. Whether it's WCW and WF back in the 90s or now, currently WWE. Or even something like an Impact Wrestling. I would say the TNA Impact was definitely got more views and got higher ratings than New Japan ever did, at least in America, in the United States, and in the Western market. So even TNA was at its peak a much bigger company than New Japan, at least fame-wise and mainstream-wise and recognizability. Because again, it's hard for New Japan to have that crossover appeal when most of your roster is predominantly non-English speaking Japanese wrestlers, and they're not necessarily these outstanding, dynamic, English cutting promos and hyper charismatic Hulk Hogan type guys, or guys like Rock and Stone Cold. They don't have anything like that, and so when they're missing these key characters that should be draws, and I don't even think the gaijin or the non-Japanese wrestlers, whether it's the white wrestlers that's from other countries like a New Zealand or a Canada or America, the white Caucasian wrestlers like a Kenny Omega or an Adam Cole or a Cody or a Young Bucks or even what is it, Giant Bernard and those kind of guys, and even somebody like a Prince Devitt. Yeah, they might have been somewhat recognizable stars in New Japan, and they had some some success in New Japan, they're not necessarily big names in the West. You know what I'm saying? They're not necessarily recognizable. Like Kenny Omega, nobody really cares about Kenny Omega. Nobody knows about him, and no, he's not a mainstream name here in the Western world. You know, like a few people that follow, you know what I'm saying, like they follow Wrestle Kingdom and all that stuff and the Okada matches. Yeah, they might know about him. They've heard about Omega. But he's not a mainstream name. He's not a huge, like, recognizable star. You know, he's nowhere near the level of somebody like The Rock or even like a Batista or, you know, a John Cena, you know, or even like a Roman Reigns. You know, so Kenny Omega is just, he's a much smaller, less recognized name. He might have been big in Japan. You know, there is that term of being big in Japan, being a star or a celebrity in Japan, but you're not that famous outside of the Japanese market or outside of the East Asian market because, you know, you're missing that Western market appeal. You're missing size. You're missing mainstream charismatic appeal or some kind of a superstar, larger than life celebrity status. You know, and I think a lot of the guys that make it in Japan, they're not exactly that interesting. You know, a few guys that do make it are you know, they do have star appeal. Somebody like a Vader, Scott Steiner, you know, those kind of guys. But for the most part, it's like it's Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks. You know, these guys that are not necessarily like highly marketable guys in the mainstream. You know, even if they have a lot of in-ring talent and they can adapt really nicely to the strong style and all that, they're not that great as far as charisma-wise. They're not that outstanding. They're not larger than life. They don't have that huge personality. They're not. You know, people don't look at him as I gotta go buy his T-shirt, or I gotta go buy his action figure, or I gotta go, you know, buy a ticket to see him live. It's like, Kenny Omega, he's just kind of a small Canadian guy that likes to do flips and dives and flips and dives. Like, you can see flips and dives in the WWE right now. Guys like Ricochet and, you know, guys in the cruiserweight division, like, you know, wherever those guys are, you know, whoever's in the cruiserweight division right now that's doing their thing. And also, you know, guys like Mustafa Ali, and so, you know, WWE already has high flyers. They already got, you know, guys like AJ Styles that's been in New Japan. You know what I'm saying? And then, you know, at least with WWE, they try to make stars. They try to have, you know, at least some people that have charismatic personality and good mic skills and look really, really attractive. You know, somebody like an Alexa Bliss or you know, even somebody like Elias, somebody that has some personality, an actual character. And when you look at New Japan, they don't have anything like that. They don't have a guy that plays the guitar. They don't have a, you know, a good-looking blonde woman that's like really charismatic and really kind of a, you know, a mean girl. They don't have anything like that. You know, so they're missing a lot of different things that the Western market is looking for in a top star. Like, I don't care how many times Okada dyes his hair blonde, you know, to appeal to a more mainstream audience, because, you know, some Japanese stars, they like to dye their hair blonde, make themselves look a bit more westernized with the dyed blonde hair or dyed brown hair, and you know, some of them even put like fake contacts in, so they try to appeal more to the westernized market. But the thing is, they're not cutting promos in English. They don't have an easily identifiable character aside from their moniker, like the Rainmaker Okada, or, you know, Los Ingobernables de Japón, Naito. You know, so it's like they'll have these different gimmicks attached to them, but they're not easily identifiable. Like, I remember Shinsuke Nakamura. I had no idea what Shinsuke's character was. Even when I was watching him in New Japan, he was doing the dancing stuff and, you know, his poses and all that. And I remember Jim Ross would be like, he's influenced by guys like Freddie Mercury and Michael Jackson. And I'm like, okay, I can kind of see it now. But it's like, what's his character? He's the king of strong style? Okay, so he's the king of strong style. All right, but is he like, how many like interesting segments he's in? Is he in any funny or really charismatic segments? Or incredible moments outside of the in-ring matches, you know? That's what made the Attitude Era so memorable, was they had funny or really highly entertaining backstage segments. And again, like, New Japan doesn't really have that. So I could keep going on, talk about why New Japan is really not that great. And by the way, I don't dislike New Japan. I think they're a pretty good alternative in the ring, compared to WWE. Like, as far as the in-ring matches, they got some really good matches. It's just that they're missing a lot of things, and I just don't think they will never take over. They'll never take over the States, USA. They'll never really be big in North America. They're just going to be kind of a smaller niche market that's kind of like even smaller than like Impact, smaller than TNA, just maybe around the same level as Ring of Honor fan base. Just they're never really going to cross over to the mainstream, unfortunately, because again, I've already said it. They don't have larger than life, like, super interesting stars that you can easily identify with. They don't have a solid women's division at all, and they're missing a lot of, like, a lot of XXX appeal or beauty appeal that you would cater to, the hot-blooded young male that's looking for hot chicks too. And it's like, they're just missing a lot. They don't have the merchandise, what I'm saying, aside from maybe like the Bullet Club stuff. They're missing like action figures. You don't see their action figures at the stores. If you go to Toys R Us or something like that, or a local toy store like Smith's in the UK, you're not going to see like New Japan action figures or toys or merch or anything like that. You're not going to see New Japan video games at the game store, GameStop or EB Games or whatever. So they're missing a lot of presence in the mainstream. They don't have no trading cards that we see here in North America. You see, I'll go to Walmart and I can find WWE trading cards, for example. You can find their merch everywhere, but not with New Japan. So it's very hard to follow New Japan and really get into them because they're missing so many different things. Yeah, and I don't care how good their in-ring product is, they're never going to take over the WWE. They're never going to get like super mainstream here. Unfortunately, it's the way it is. I think they're happy being kind of a very distant second place, if they really are a second place company in terms of business-wise and attendance-wise and stuff like that. And they might be the biggest company in Japan, but they're never going to like take over the States or the Western world because they're such a limited company. They don't have as much mainstream appeal as much as people would like to think that they do, or because of the internet, they're all over the internet. Not really. You know what I'm saying? So unfortunately, it is what it is. New Japan is never going to be that big. That's it for this episode of the Review Space. Check out the channel for more videos. Check out more wrestling topics on the channel. It's already uploaded. Subscribe and all that. Click on the bell button for the latest notifications. And until next time, peace.